There was a time when almost every American town had a street like this. Not wide, not impressive. Just a few blocks long, often no more than a straight line cutting through the center of town. Brick buildings standing shoulder to shoulder, display windows slightly dusty, signs faded by decades of sun and weather. A place that did not try to impress anyone because it never needed to. Today, the street is still here. The pavement remains. The buildings remain. But something else is missing. Something harder to name than boarded windows or empty storefronts. In the late afternoon light, the silence feels heavier than it should. You can hear your footsteps echo where once they were absorbed by the noise of everyday life. A bell above a door no longer rings. A bench sits unused, facing nothing in particular. The street waits, not for crowds, but for a purpose it once understood without thinking. There are towns all across America where this scene repeats itself, almost exactly as if copied from memory rather than design. Streets that once knew everyone who passed through them. Streets that remembered faces, routines, habits. Streets that did not need to ask who you were, because they already knew. Nothing here announces what has been lost. There are no plaques, no official markers, no clear moment where one can say, "This is when it ended." The absence is quiet, and because it is quiet, it is easy to overlook. A long time ago, this street would have been awake before sunrise. Lights on behind counters. Coffee poured into chipped mugs. Deliveries unloaded by hand. By mid-morning, the sidewalks belonged to conversations that had no agenda. People did not come here to be entertained. They came because this was where life happened. Children once knew these blocks by heart. Adults measured time by what happened here. Birthdays, promotions, small victories, small failures. All of it passed through this narrow corridor of storefronts and sidewalks. The street absorbed it without ceremony. What makes this place difficult to explain is that it never thought of itself as important. It was not a destination. It was not a symbol. It was simply where things were done. And because it felt permanent, it was never protected as something fragile. Now standing here, the emptiness does not feel dramatic. It feels unfinished. As if the day never quite began and never quite ended either. The buildings hold their shape, but the rhythm that once animated them has slipped away, leaving behind a shell that looks familiar and strange at the same time. This is not the story of a single town. It is not the story of failure or collapse. It is the story of something that faded while everyone was busy living inside it. Before there were explanations, before there were reasons, before anyone thought to ask what might be lost, there was simply a street like this. Ordinary, reliable, and full. And a way of life that assumed it would always be there. Long before it was called Main Street, it was simply the place where paths crossed. In the late 19th century, as towns began to form across the American landscape, people did not set out to design symbols or civic centers. They built where it made sense to build. Near the tracks, near the river, near the road that connected one place to the next. What later became the main street was not imagined as a destination. It emerged naturally, almost accidentally, from the simple need to be close to one another. When the railroad arrived, it did not just bring goods. It brought timing, routine, expectation. Trains arrived on schedules that shaped the day. Merchants learned when to open their doors by listening for the whistle in the distance. Farmers knew when to come to town. News arrived with the freight, carried in bundles of paper and spoken aloud before it was ever read. Buildings went up slowly, one beside the other, as if the street were assembling itself piece by piece. A general store first, then a hardware shop, a barber, a pharmacy with a counter where people lingered longer than necessary. These were not investments in growth. They were responses to presence. Someone was already here. Someone needed something. Someone would be back tomorrow. The street was narrow because walking was assumed. Distance mattered differently then. Being close was not a convenience. It was a condition of life. A town that spread too far apart would simply not function. People needed to see each other, to pass each other, to recognize each other without effort. What gave these streets their power was not size, but density of life. Everything essential happened within a few blocks. Work, trade, conversation, disagreement, reconciliation. A person could leave home in the morning and return in the evening, having lived an entire day without ever leaving the orbit of that street. Commerce here did not feel abstract. You knew who sold you your shoes because you had known him since childhood. You knew where the money went because it stayed nearby. When a business closed, it was not an economic signal. It was a personal event. Someone's name disappeared from a window. Someone's routine ended. The street learned the town's habits. It knew when church let out. It knew when school ended. It knew which afternoons would be quiet and which would be full. There was an unspoken choreography to it all, passed down without instruction. What mattered most was not efficiency, but presence. People did not rush through this place. They moved at a pace that allowed interruption. A quick errand became a conversation. A conversation became a pause. Time here was elastic, stretching and compressing according to human interaction rather than schedules. For many towns, the main street grew alongside the idea of permanence. Brick replaced wood not because it looked better, but because it lasted longer. Storefronts were built to endure weather, fire, and time. The street was expected to outlive the people who walked it. There was also a moral gravity to these places, though no one would have described it that way. Reputation mattered because visibility was constant. You were known not by what you claimed, but by how you showed up day after day in the same space as everyone else. The street remembered. Children learned the boundaries of their world here. They ran errands not because it was efficient, but because it taught responsibility. Adults learned restraint because behavior carried consequences that could not be escaped by distance or anonymity. This was not an idyllic place. Disagreements happened openly. Hardship was visible. Success was uneven. But everything existed within a shared frame. The street did not separate people into categories. It placed them side by side. As towns matured into the early 20th century, the street became more than a convenience. It became an anchor. Even those who rarely visited felt its presence as something stable, something known. It was where announcements were made, where celebrations spilled out onto sidewalks, where grief was acknowledged without needing to be spoken. What is easy to miss, looking back, is how little intention there was behind this. No one stood at the beginning and said this street would matter for generations. It mattered because people depended on it without questioning why. The strength of the small-town Main Street was not vision. It was necessity combined with proximity. A way of life formed around it not because it was planned, but because it worked. And because it worked, it was trusted. That trust would become important later when the world began to change in ways no one on these sidewalks could yet see. By the time the middle of the 20th century arrived, the small-town Main Street no longer felt new. It felt settled, assured, like something that had found its final shape and saw no reason to change. This was the period people would later call the height of it, though no one living inside those years would have recognized them as such. Nothing about the street announced itself as exceptional. It simply worked, day after day, in a way that felt dependable enough to disappear into the background of life. In the mornings, the street belonged to routine. Shopkeepers lifted metal grates and unlocked doors with keys worn smooth by years of use. Windows were cleaned, not to impress strangers, but because someone you knew would be looking through them. Deliveries arrived quietly. Shelves were stocked by hand. The day unfolded at a pace set not by urgency but by habit. By late morning, the sidewalks filled with familiar faces, not crowds, but a steady presence. People came not only to buy what they needed, but to be seen doing so. A trip to the hardware store meant stopping to speak with someone outside the post office. A visit to the pharmacy meant leaning against the counter longer than necessary, exchanging news that would never make it into print. The street was an economic center, but money was not the point. Transactions were personal. Credit was extended on trust. Mistakes were remembered, but so was effort. A business survived not by marketing, but by showing up reliably and treating people in ways that would be remembered the next time they crossed paths. At midday, the street shifted. Lunch counters filled. Cafes hummed with low conversation. The same stools held the same people, often in the same order, year after year. No one needed to ask what someone would order. The ritual mattered more than the food itself. This was also the street's social center, though that term feels too formal for what it was. Encounters were unplanned, conversations were unscheduled. You did not arrange to see people here, you simply did. That unpredictability was part of its function. It stitched the town together without ceremony. Children moved through the street with a sense of permission that is difficult to imagine now. They were not supervised closely, because supervision was communal. Adults noticed, corrected, encouraged. The street itself acted as a boundary, teaching awareness without fear. In the evenings, the street softened. Lights glowed in storefronts and theaters. Families arrived dressed slightly better than usual, not because it was required, but because it felt right. The cinema marquee changed slowly, its letters rearranged by hand. The anticipation of what was showing mattered almost as much as the film itself. This was where announcements were absorbed rather than broadcast. Engagements were noticed, promotions acknowledged, losses felt collectively. A closed shop for a funeral drew quiet understanding. The street adjusted its rhythm without needing explanation. What gave this place its weight was not activity alone, but meaning layered over time. Every doorway carried memory. Every corner had a story, even if no one bothered to tell it anymore. The street functioned as a shared archive, storing the town's experiences in physical space. Morality here was not enforced by rules but by visibility. You did not behave well because you were watched. You behaved well because you would meet the same people again tomorrow. Reputation was not a concept. It was a daily reality. Importantly, the street did not belong to any single generation. Older residents occupied it in the mornings. Younger ones claimed it in the afternoons. Teenagers learned independence by lingering at its edges. Everyone had a place within it, and no one needed permission to exist there. The predictability of it all created a quiet confidence. Life felt bounded, but not constrained. The future seemed understandable because the present repeated itself gently. People assumed that what had worked yesterday would work tomorrow. This was not a golden age in the sense of perfection. There were struggles, inequalities, silences that went unchallenged. But the street held those contradictions together without breaking apart. It did not resolve them. It contained them. Perhaps the most important thing about this era is how little attention it drew to itself. The street was not celebrated because it was not questioned. It felt permanent enough to ignore. The idea that it might one day disappear would have sounded strange, even foolish. No one preserved what they assumed would endure. And so the small-town Main Street continued, steady and unremarkable, carrying the weight of everyday life so effortlessly that few noticed how much of that life depended on it. The danger was not that people failed to love it. The danger was that they never thought they would need to. What made the small-town Main Street so vulnerable was not neglect, or even change. It was familiarity. By the middle of the 20th century, the street no longer felt like something that had been built. It felt like something that had always been there. People did not speak of it with pride or concern. They spoke of it the way one speaks of gravity or weather, as a given condition of life. No one woke up thinking about the street. They simply moved through it, the way they had yesterday, the way they expected to tomorrow. It did not require admiration to survive, because it seemed incapable of disappearing. This sense of permanence shaped behavior in subtle ways. Maintenance happened, but preservation did not. Buildings were repaired, not revered. Traditions continued not because they were cherished, but because there was no reason to stop them. The street did not need defending, because no one imagined an alternative. For children growing up during this time, the street was not history. It was background. They did not learn about it. They absorbed it. It taught them where they belonged without explanation. When they left town for school or work, they carried an image of it inside them, assuming it would be waiting when they returned. Adults measured progress against it without realizing they were doing so. A successful week meant a busy street. A good year meant familiar businesses still open. Trouble was sensed when something felt off, but even then, concern rarely rose to alarm. Small disruptions had always corrected themselves before. The street's greatest strength was also its quiet weakness. It relied on shared assumptions. Assumptions about proximity, about time, about the importance of showing up in person, about the value of being known. These assumptions were not defended because they were not articulated. They lived beneath awareness, guiding behavior without announcing themselves. When people spoke about what mattered, they spoke about family, work, faith, responsibility. The street was simply where those values played out. No one called it an era. No one marked it as stable. Stability does not announce itself. It reveals itself only in hindsight, once it is gone. The pace of life during these years reinforced the illusion of endurance. Days followed patterns that rarely changed. Seasons brought predictable shifts. There was time to notice small details, but no urgency to imagine large transformations. Even as technology advanced elsewhere, its presence on the street felt modest. Improvements arrived slowly enough to feel like enhancements rather than disruptions. New appliances appeared in store windows. Radios gave way to televisions. Cars became more common, but they did not yet dominate the street's logic. What mattered was that people still oriented their lives around shared space. The street remained the place where information was verified through presence. You did not trust news fully until you heard it echoed by someone else you knew. You did not feel something was real until it appeared here, embodied. This created a sense of continuity that blurred past and present. Stories from decades earlier felt close, because they happened in the same physical places. A corner where someone once stood during a celebration still held that memory, even if no one spoke of it anymore. The street did not change much, and that was the point. Change happened slowly enough to feel manageable. Predictability was not boring, it was comforting. It allowed people to invest emotionally without fear of sudden loss. And because loss had not yet arrived, no one rehearsed for it. There were signs, of course, but signs are easier to ignore when they do not threaten the immediate present. A shop closed here or there. A younger generation spoke of opportunities elsewhere. Cars made it easier to leave town for the day. But leaving was still temporary. Returning was assumed. The idea that the street itself might one day become optional would have felt abstract, almost absurd. Why would anyone choose not to gather where everyone already was? This is how something essential becomes invisible, not because it is unimportant, but because it works too well. The street's success disguised its fragility. It had never needed to compete. It had never needed to persuade. It had never needed to explain its value. It existed because people lived in ways that required it. And as long as those ways of living felt natural, the street felt eternal. The danger did not come from hostility or rejection. It came from quiet shifts in daily habits, so small at first that they did not feel like changes at all. By the time anyone noticed that something fundamental was moving beneath their feet, the street was already beginning to loosen its grip on the life it once held together. The small-town Main Street did not collapse. It did not fall apart in a single moment, nor did it announce its decline with anything resembling drama. What happened instead was quieter, and because it was quiet, it took time to recognize. Change arrived not as an event, but as a series of small adjustments to daily life. At first, it felt like convenience. Cars became more central, not as novelties, but as necessities. Distances that once felt meaningful began to shrink. A trip that once required planning now required only ignition. Time reorganized itself around speed rather than presence. The street remained, but it was no longer the only place where things happened. New roads appeared at the edges of town, wider and straighter than anything the old street had known. They did not invite lingering. They encouraged movement. Their purpose was not gathering, but passing through. People used them without thinking much about what they replaced. Shopping began to shift in subtle ways. What once required several stops along the same sidewalk could now be done elsewhere, faster, with fewer interruptions. Parking became easier. The weather mattered less. Efficiency began to quietly outrank familiarity. None of this felt like abandonment. People still visited the street. They still recognized faces. But visits grew shorter. Errands became tasks to complete rather than opportunities for encounter. Conversations were postponed. Lingering felt indulgent. The rhythm began to change. National chains arrived without fanfare, often just beyond the traditional center of town. Their buildings looked similar no matter where they stood. Their signs were brighter, their hours longer. They asked less of customers and in return offered less connection. Local businesses tried to adapt, but adaptation required choices that felt uncomfortable. Competing on price was difficult. Competing on speed was exhausting. Competing on familiarity assumed people still valued it in the same way. Many still did, but not always enough. Television altered evenings without announcing itself as a transformation. People gathered less in shared spaces and more in private rooms. News arrived from far away, polished and authoritative, reducing the need for confirmation through conversation. The world grew larger, and the street grew comparatively smaller. Work began to pull people away from town centers during the day. Commuting normalized absence. Lunch was eaten elsewhere. Midday foot traffic thinned. The street learned new quiet hours it had never known before. What made this erosion difficult to resist was that it did not feel like loss. It felt like progress. Each change offered something tangible: comfort, speed, variety. The cost was diffuse, spread across time and space, rarely felt all at once. No one gathered to debate whether the street should remain central. There was no vote, no announcement. Life simply reorganized itself around new habits. Buildings began to show strain, not from neglect, but from uncertainty. Owners hesitated to invest heavily in places that felt less essential. Repairs became temporary. Renovations were delayed. A sense of waiting settled in, though no one could say what they were waiting for. Younger generations experienced the street differently. They still recognized it, but it no longer defined their social lives. Independence no longer required walking into town. Cars offered escape without effort. Identity could be formed elsewhere. The street did not protest this shift. It had no voice. It responded the only way it could, by accommodating less and less of daily life. What once absorbed the town's energy now received what was left over. There was no single villain in this story, no decision that could be pointed to as the beginning of the end. Each change made sense on its own. Together they altered the conditions that had once made the street indispensable, and because the physical structures remained standing, it was easy to believe nothing fundamental had changed. Storefronts still opened, signs still hung, but the density of meaning had thinned. Fewer people arrived without purpose. Fewer stayed without reason. The street began to feel like a place one visited rather than inhabited. Perhaps the most telling sign was emotional rather than visual. When a shop closed, it no longer felt personal. It felt unfortunate but expected. The disappearance of familiar names from windows began to register as part of a broader pattern, not a local tragedy. The street was still there, but it no longer set the tempo of town life. It followed it, and in following it lost something difficult to reclaim: its role as the place where life naturally converged. By the end of this period, many towns could sense that something was different, though few could articulate exactly what. The street felt quieter, but not abandoned. Familiar, but slightly distant. It was still trusted, but no longer relied upon. The erosion had done its work not by destruction, but by substitution. And because substitutions rarely announce what they replace, the loss remained unnamed. The street did not end. It simply began to matter less, one ordinary day at a time. By the time the changes became visible, the causes were already distant. In many towns, the signs appeared slowly enough to be mistaken for temporary setbacks. A storefront went dark. Another reduced its hours. A familiar name disappeared from a window and was quietly replaced by nothing at all. People noticed, but they did not panic. This had happened before. It would correct itself. Often, it did not. The street began to carry empty spaces the way a face carries lines with age. At first, they were easy to ignore. One vacant building among many occupied ones did not alter the overall impression. The sidewalk still saw movement. The lights still came on in the evenings. The street still resembled itself. But absence accumulates. When one business closed, it reduced foot traffic for the next. Fewer people walking past meant fewer spontaneous stops. Fewer stops meant thinner margins. The street had always functioned as a system, each part reinforcing the others. As pieces weakened, the whole lost resilience. Property owners faced decisions that felt pragmatic at the time. Maintaining aging buildings for uncertain tenants carried risk. Some chose not to renovate. Others sold to investors with no connection to the town, whose interest lay in holding rather than restoring. Time stretched between closures and reopenings until reopening ceased to feel likely. The street's architecture remained, but its function drifted. Spaces designed for daily commerce sat idle. Windows displayed dust instead of goods. Doors stayed locked through hours that once marked the peak of activity. The street learned new forms of stillness. What changed most profoundly was not appearance, but expectation. People stopped assuming the street would provide what they needed. They stopped checking first. Errands were planned elsewhere. The street became a backup rather than a starting point. This shift in expectation was quiet, but decisive. Once people no longer relied on the street, its decline accelerated without resistance. Dependence had once protected it. Indifference left it exposed. Community events moved away as well. Parades shortened or rerouted. Gatherings took place in larger, more flexible spaces. The street, once the natural stage for collective life, felt less accommodating. Its narrow sidewalks and limited parking, once strengths, now seemed inconvenient. Even when businesses tried to revive the old rhythm, they struggled against habits that had already changed. A new cafe opened, but customers treated it as a destination rather than a stop along a routine. The difference mattered. Destination requires intention. Routine sustains itself. As years passed, the street began to resemble a photograph more than a living place. It was recognizable, even comforting, but static. People spoke of it in the past tense even while standing on it. "There used to be," became a common phrase, repeated without bitterness as if stating a fact of nature. Generational distance widened the gap. Those who remembered the street's fullness spoke of it with detail. Those who did not remember accepted its emptiness as normal. Memory became unevenly distributed, and with it, urgency faded. Municipal efforts came and went. Revitalization plans were proposed. Banners were hung. Facades were refreshed. But surface changes could not restore the conditions that had once made the street central. Without daily dependence, these efforts felt like gestures rather than transformations. The street did not resist this role. It adapted again, as it always had. But adaptation now meant accommodating less. Fewer hours, fewer tenants, less reason to be there unless one chose to be. What remained was a sense of dissonance. The physical form suggested importance. The lived reality contradicted it. Streets built to carry density now held emptiness. Buildings designed for interaction housed silence. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of this period was its emotional ambiguity. There was no clear moment of grief. Loss unfolded too gradually to demand mourning. People adjusted, step by step, until adjustment became acceptance. When the last long-standing business closed, it rarely drew crowds. There was no ceremony. The door was locked. A sign was posted. Life continued elsewhere. The street endured, but endurance without purpose feels hollow. What had once been a living framework for community became a reminder of how community had reorganized itself away from shared space. By the end of the 20th century, many small-town main streets existed in a state of suspension, not fully abandoned, not truly alive, maintained just enough to avoid collapse, but no longer trusted with the weight of daily life. They stood as evidence of something that had worked once and might work again under different conditions, but for now, remained incomplete. The decline was not dramatic. It was not tragic in the traditional sense. It was simply the result of a way of life that no longer required what the street was built to provide. The buildings stayed. the meaning moved on. When people speak about the disappearance of small-town main streets, they often point to what can be counted: closed shops, empty buildings, reduced tax bases. These are visible losses, easy to photograph and document. But they are not what hurt the most, nor what lingered longest. What was lost cannot be boarded up or reopened. The true loss was not economic activity, but the slow, informal web of recognition that once held towns together. The street was not just a place where people exchanged money. It was where people exchanged acknowledgement, where they were seen without having to announce themselves. On those sidewalks, people learned who they were in relation to others, not through declarations, but through repetition. The baker knew your habits. The shopkeeper knew your family. The clerk noticed when something was wrong because absence itself was noticeable. To not appear was to be remarked upon. This kind of recognition created a form of belonging that required no membership and no effort. You belonged simply by showing up. Over time, that presence accumulated into identity. You were not anonymous, but you were also not curated. You did not perform yourself. You were known through consistency. When the street faded from daily life, that quiet recognition faded with it. What replaced it was not hostility or isolation, but neutrality. People became harder to read because they were encountered less often. Lives unfolded in parallel rather than intersecting. Familiarity gave way to polite distance. The town still existed, but it no longer knew itself in the same way. Another loss was the disappearance of unplanned encounter. The street once forced interaction without demanding intimacy. You spoke to people not because you sought connection, but because proximity made it natural. These brief exchanges carried weight precisely because they were unscheduled. Without them, social life became more intentional, and paradoxically, more fragile. Meetings required planning. Relationships required effort. The small moments that once reinforced social fabric disappeared quietly, leaving behind connections that felt thinner, more easily broken. The street also served as a mirror. It reflected the town back to itself daily. Successes were visible. Struggles were visible. Change was observable in real time. This visibility created a shared sense of reality. As life moved into private spaces and distant destinations, that shared mirror cracked. People experienced the town differently depending on where they spent their time. Common reference points weakened. Conversations became less grounded in shared experience. Local identity suffered in ways that were difficult to articulate. The street had once told the town who it was without words. Its businesses reflected local needs. Its rhythms reflected local values. When those signals disappeared, identity became more abstract. Towns began to describe themselves rather than experience themselves. There was also a moral dimension to this loss, though it is rarely named. The street once created accountability through presence. Behavior mattered because it echoed. Kindness was remembered. Cruelty had consequences, not through enforcement but through continuity. As interactions dispersed, accountability became optional. One could move through daily life without leaving impressions. This freedom felt liberating at first, but over time, it weakened the sense of responsibility that comes from being known. Even solitude changed. Alone no longer meant temporarily separate from community. It meant fully detached. The street had once allowed people to be alone together, occupying the same space without obligation. That shared solitude carried comfort. Its absence left a different kind of quiet. Perhaps the deepest loss was temporal rather than social. The street once slowed time. It created pauses without labeling them as such. Waiting in line became conversation. Errands became encounters. Life expanded to fill the space between tasks. Without the street, time tightened. Efficiency became the default measure. Moments not optimized felt wasted. The space for lingering shrank, and with it, the space for reflection. None of this vanished suddenly. It dissolved gradually as habits shifted and expectations adjusted. People adapted without realizing what they were adapting away from. By the time absence was noticed, it had already become normal. What makes this loss difficult to mourn is that nothing clearly broke. There was no disaster, no single decision, no visible failure. The street simply stopped being necessary, and necessity had always been its foundation. The buildings remain as witnesses, but they cannot testify fully to what has gone missing. They hold the shape of a life that once passed through them, but not the life itself. What was lost was a way of being together without effort, a way of knowing without asking, a way of belonging without declaration. These things do not announce their departure. They are only recognized once they are no longer there.